What is the history of Houston's AAPI residents, and how do they navigate the challenges of holding onto their culture and language while also assimilating? To provide us with some answers and perspective to these questions, we have Ann Chow, founder of the Houston Asian American Archive at Rice University, Chitra Divakaruni, an award-winning author, poet, and professor of creative writing at the University of Houston, and Chow Win, a former TV news reporter and now Chief Public Strategies Officer at the Houston Area Women's Center. I'm KHOU 11 anchor reporter Sherman Chow, and these are Cultural Conversations.
In the old days, when people talked about Asians in the US, the first thought was, well, Chinese, Japanese, but that was about it. And that wasn't really right then. Of course, it's not right now. So Anne, can you give us an idea about who actually makes up the Asian American Pacific Islander community?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. The four largest group of Asian ethnic groups in the United States is really the Indians, the Vietnamese, the Chinese, and the Filipinos. They came into this country at different times for different reasons, but these are the four largest groups, especially in the state of Texas.
So what brought these groups to Texas, kind of in what kind of waves? What motivated that?
Well, the Chinese we know came during the gold rush in 1848. And when the gold rush was over, they went to work on the Intercontinental Railroad. And when that is over, they kind of drifted to the south and then worked on plantations, opened grocery stores, and laundromats. So they've been in this south since the late 19th, early 20th century, and some of them came to Houston, Texas as well. The largest influx of Chinese to Houston would be the 1950s, and then they stayed on and had their own family businesses. The Indian Americans came much later. Their largest group really came after the opening relaxation, the immigration law in 1965. Before that, there were Indian Americans in the United States. Some of them were students. But after the immigration laws started restricting Indians from coming in, very few remained. And then for the Japanese Americans, they did come in the early 20th century at the invitation of Texan authorities to create a kind of new strain of rice. They came in, bought acres and acres of rice farming land in Webster, Texas, and they tried to develop a new kind of rice plantation. Unfortunately, there was a downturn in the world market for rice. They lost a lot of money, and at the same time, they were beginning to feel the rise of xenophobia, and they were basically not welcome in Texas. And then we have the Vietnamese Americans who came in basically after the fall of Saigon in 1975. They were relocated from Vietnam to the refugee camps in Southeast Asia, and then many of them came to the United States. They were settled in different military camps around the country, and then many came down to the Gulf Coast, started shrimping industries, and then eventually moved on into real estate and restaurant businesses. And then the last group were the Filipinos. The Filipinos were originally American nationals because the Philippines was actually a protectorate of the United States. There were very few in this country before 1965. After 1965, many of them we know are in the medical profession, especially nurses, and they came in large groups to the medical center in Houston.
Asian Americans are Americans with origins in the Far East, Southeast Asia, or the Indian subcontinent, including Cambodia, China, India, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, Pakistan, the Philippine Islands, Thailand, and Vietnam. Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islanders are persons with origins in Hawaii, Guam, Samoa, or other Pacific Islands. Texas has the third largest Asian American population in the U.S., behind California and New York. Texas ranks fourth among states in total Pacific Islander population, behind Hawaii, California, and Washington. There are an estimated 309,400 Asians in Houston-Harris County. That was in 2017, and would break down to nearly 7% of our area's total population. The largest group is Vietnamese, followed by Asian Indian, Chinese, and Filipino. Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders numbered an estimated 3,091 in Houston and Harris County. The largest group was Guamanian, followed by Native Hawaiian and Samoan.
Chow, your family, part of the Vietnamese refugees that left during the fall of Saigon. We hear a lot about boat people, little boats, big boats. It's a very emotional and dramatic story. Are you comfortable sharing that with us?
Absolutely. And yes, my family was among the first wave of refugees, Vietnamese refugees, who came at the fall of Saigon. So my parents left with nothing but the clothes on their backs and their children in tow. I was the youngest of four. I was two when I came in 1975. And it took months for us to get here and go military refugee camp, if you will, resettlement sort of program in Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. And I have to joke, I always ask my parents, why didn't you stop at California or Hawaii? There were so many Vietnamese at the time who were not only sponsored by Catholic Charities and the families that were part of that refugee resettlement program, but they wanted a climate and an atmosphere that was similar to Saigon, where they're from. Warm, flat, hot, humid. And so most of my upbringing was here in the great city of Houston, and just, straddling two cultures, being the daughter of Vietnamese refugee immigrants, being a Vietnamese refugee immigrant myself, and then trying to acculturate into the American culture and growing up in the west side of town and embracing all things American, while at the same time in my home, doing everything that was very culturally Vietnamese.
I think that's probably a similar story for a lot of folks, but yeah, coming as refugees, that's a whole different chapter, a whole different story. Chitra, I know that you were born and raised in India, and you came for grad school. And it seems to me like there are a lot of Asians in academia, and I'm thinking it can't just be my imagination, or is it? You know something, especially with the University of Houston, about populations.
Yes, and absolutely. I came here as a graduate student, and the University of Houston is very hospitable to graduate students from many countries. And actually, the Chinese, the Indian, and the Vietnamese students are our biggest foreign student population in that order. And there's a lot of professors who are in that field as well. But Houston has been, and many of our students, whoever can, they do want to stay on in Houston, because for a lot of them, it's very funny. I was laughing as I was listening to people talk about why families choose Houston. Yes, it is warm, and that is very attractive to Indians. Many of us do not want to fight the ice and snow. So I think, and the fact that there are so many wonderful jobs available. So, that has made Houston, Texas, the second largest state with the Indian population, the Indian American population being at high numbers. California is number one, and then Texas is the second one.
Yeah,
so,
yeah,
yes.
and I guess like at U of H, more than half of the foreign students are from Asia.
Yes, definitely. And as I said, China, India, and Vietnam are the three biggest populations. And I think the other place where we see a lot of Indian, not just Indian students from India, but the Indian American population, two areas that are really popular. And now at UH, we have both of them. One is engineering, and the other is medicine.
So you, though, decided to write in
Yes.
English, doing great. You've got two books that were turned into movies. And I think it's a bit interesting. Like all of our panelists today, I think I'm right in saying none of us, our first language is English. I think all of us have another first language. And yet we have a writer, we have a lecturer, a woman who speaks and broadcasts in English. And I'm talking about Chow Win. For those of you who may not know, Chow used to be a TV reporter also at Channel 11. How do you look at your cultural ties now? Because it's sort of, it's an interesting process, right? Being a new, even as a child, coming to a new place, a new country, and then grown up. And sometimes when we're kids, we just want to be exactly like everybody else. And then as you get older, maybe we develop our own confidence, we kind of come into ourselves. Did you see any of that kind of process come with you? And you've got your own little girls now.
Yeah, I absolutely experienced it being a refugee, an immigrant, and then growing up in effectively the white suburbs made me feel very otherized or different. Or growing up, I wanted to be just like those girls in the schoolyard and I wanted to wear their clothes, but I was eating different food and my home smelled different and we're eating rice and my parents were packing me bento boxes and not, normal kid lunch boxes. That was something that I really struggled with as a child, feeling very different, looking very different, and not knowing that my culture was attractive or embraced in and of itself. Now, just like you said, Sherman, as I got older, became more exposed to the world around me, I lived overseas in Guam and Saipan early in my television news career. I began to realize and embrace my cultural heritage. So I joke very often that I was a born again Asian much later in my life as an adult. One of the things I did learn is, I didn't speak out like young people are starting to speak out with this racial reckoning. I like I was told, like, put your head down, work very hard, get through school, become a success, those kinds of things. Now, just like you, Sherman, I followed a career that was not doctor, lawyer, engineer. I followed the love for storytelling and journalism. And now I'm ultimately a social worker working in advocacy at a nonprofit. And I think I really embraced that because my parents allowed me to do that. I'm not sure in sort of this, Vietnamese upbringing, if they had said, no, you can't do that, I might have been a doctor, a lawyer, or engineer. So I appreciated that piece of my culture, that my parents didn't force me to go into the sort of the traditional, careers that young Asian immigrant children were asked to do. I have family members who became doctors, lawyers, and dentists and those kinds of things, and then moved on to different careers. Straddling two cultures growing up was challenging, to say the least. And as I've gotten older, and as you said, I have two young daughters who are 8 and 10 who are biracial, and watching them and experiencing the fact that they can ask questions about Black Lives Matter and sort of the George Floyd reckoning, and we can share in those conversations has been very heartening for me. And knowing that my kids will grow up in a place where they have a voice and they can straddle two cultures comfortably and naturally without feeling like they have to put their head down and move forward.
Let's take a look at education rates for Harris County's AAPI population. More than half of Asian adults 25 years or older have a bachelor's degree or higher. This percentage is higher than the average for all races and ethnicities in Harris County, and it stands at 30.5%. It is also higher than the percentage of bachelor's degrees or higher for whites, which is 47.2%. The rate of bachelor's degrees or higher much lower for Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders, currently at 22%.
I guess, Anne, of this whole group, you're the only one with a traditionally respectable job. You're an educator, a teacher. The rest of us are all, our families are like, oh my. And so we've heard some fascinating sort of individual stories from Teacher and from Chow, but you are collecting, literally hundreds of stories. What's going on at Rice? What are you doing?
So our archive was created 11 years ago out of the realization that there's no such repository of stories of the Asian American lives in Greater Houston. And Houston is the 8th largest city in the US of Asian American population. So we began very small with Mr. Gene Lee. He's the publisher of the first bilingual Chinese English newspaper and who has retired. So we collected his papers, interviewed him, and got his story in the archive. And sadly, 2 months after our interview, he passed away. But he was extremely happy and proud that his story finally was told. And then word of mouth was spread, and people tell me you should interview XYZ. As I mentioned, the earlier Chinese Americans who settled here, by the time we started our archive, they were in their 70s and 80s, and we needed to capture story quickly. So now we have 350 interviews, and we cover all of Asia. As you mentioned earlier, Asia isn't just Chinese or even Korean or Vietnamese or Filipino. It is many, many different countries. So we cover immigrants and stories from South Asia, including India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. We cover stories from Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Philippines, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, if we can get them, and then stories from East Asia, Japan, China, Hong Kong, Korea. So we keep on doing that because our aim is to put our Asian American history into the official narrative of Texas history, which right now is not there.
You're really focusing on Houston area voices and families. So this is sort of very our local story. And if I wanted to come down to Rice and take a listen, can I do that? Is it available to the public?
It's completely open. You just go online. The website is haaa.rice.edu. Chitra stories in there, and I hope to capture Chow's story, but you don't even have to come down. The only reason you may want to come into our library, where all of these things are stored in the special collection at the Woodson Research Center, is because people donate to us material, archival material. So Gordon Kwan gave us his campaign election T-shirts. Martha Wong just gave us boxes and boxes of her documents. Glenda Joe gave us all of her papers on the Asian festival, as well as her arbitration during the KKK incident with the Vietnamese boat people or the fishermen on the Gulf Coast. So we have lots of memorabilia in addition to stories.
Did you find any trends in your research?
Well, I think that the question, the kind of question we asked had to do with their lives, because at the beginning, the immigrants, some of the older ones, are very reluctant to tell us about their lives. So we asked about how did you come to Houston? What was your job? And so labor and economic issues dominated our interviews. Then very soon, when people became more comfortable, they started telling us about how they came, about marriage issues, about identity issues. So we find a lot of discussion on identity. Exactly what Chow said about feeling very different here, and then how to assimilate into this country, into this society, has become one of the most dominant themes. These days, we actually specifically got asked questions about COVID. How did you cope, or how are you giving back to the community during COVID? And then now about anti-Asian racism. How are you coping with that? How are you feeling? What are you doing about it? So there are temporal topics depending on the situation in the world, but there are also very eternal issues such as identity and assimilation, and then how to retain the culture when you're an immigrant.
May I add something to that? Because I was interviewed for it. I thought your questions were so insightful, and they invited us to tell our stories. So we weren't just, here's a question, you give an answer, but we could bring our own stories into it. And I think that's what makes a project like that really come to life. Because and I read a number of those interviews because you shared the link with me, and I was just, I could feel these people's lives. I could feel the challenges that they'd been through and the strength that they'd had to draw upon to make Houston their new home, and to make sure their families would prosper here. And I felt so much respect as I was reading the stories of the earlier immigrants, because yes, we always have challenges, but the earliest immigrants, I think, had the toughest challenges.
Yeah. Thank you, Tricia. I agree. Those stories make me feel like my life is that tiny, because they've gone through so much, but they still have so much dignity and strength. It's amazing. So please look at the archive. There are amazing stories in there.
I think also just in our everyday community, and Chitra, you and I were talking about this a little bit earlier offline, but I think there are sometimes visual examples, of people's culture that folks have questions about, but sometimes maybe we're a little bit shy. We don't want to offend or step out of bounds. And you were kind enough to say maybe you would share some insights for folks, like after Deputy Dhaliwal was killed, sadly, but as a Sikh Indian, and he wore the turban as part of his uniform, I think that raised some awareness for people.
One of the wonderful things that I love about our culture, the whole South Asian culture, is that we have kept our clothing traditions a lot, especially for the women and even for the men, and during cultural ceremonies, during family events, during weddings, particularly, you will see people dressed in our colorful saris or our kurtas or our salwar kameezes, which is the top and the loose pants. Men and women both wear them. And one of the things that I love about living here in the Houston area is there's a great deal of openness. So I teach at the University of Houston. I always wear my Indian tops. I wear them with my jeans or, with a pair of black pants. And I feel very comfortable. And I see that a lot of our Muslim students, the women feel quite comfortable wearing the hijab with their Western clothes. So there's a nice mix of Western and South Asian clothing, culture, food. We have a whole area of Houston that has been given the name the Mahatma Gandhi District, that is at 59 and Hillcroft. And here you will find wonderful little restaurants. You'll find grocery stores. You'll find places to rent movies or buy clothing, buy jewelry. People do all their wedding shopping over there. And it's very hospitable. So I do recommend for our viewers a little trip to the Mahatma Gandhi District of Houston.
Yes, but if you go, be prepared to be very stuffed when you leave. You're gonna roll out of the restaurant and into your car. So, can you explain to folks, for example, this is very popular, but the red dot, the bindi, what this represents?
The bindi, yes. If you may be noticing that I have a very a small one, a small shiny bindi. I don't know if it's showing, but that's a big part of the Hindu culture. So in India, the Hindu women will wear a bindi. Now, the red one is often for married women, and the ones of many different colors are for, women who are married or unmarried. Mine is blue because I'm matching it with my kurta. So, it's a little fashion accessory device. And I would say that when I first came to the United States, and I came and did my master's in Ohio before I moved to Berkeley to do my PhD, that was the question I was most asked. And I was a bad ambassador for my culture because after some time I got tired, and I would say things like, when we reach puberty, the dot appears on our forehead.
You're terrible, Chitra. See, you were making up stories even back then, before you knew you'd be a writer.
I think I left a lot of very confused people behind me in Ohio.
I did want to ask you one other thing. And ladies, if you have a question too, please do jump in. Especially during this COVID time, everybody's watching Netflix. So there's this hot new series out there, Indian matchmaking. And I gather that arranged marriages continue to be quite popular, not just in India, but in the US as well.
Yes.
Talk to me just a little. Yeah, to somebody else who's not familiar with that tradition, it's kind of fascinating.
Yes.
Does it work? And are young people sort of willingly going along with it, or do they feel like chow when they have to be? You must be a doctor, lawyer,
and an
engineer.
No, what is so interesting, and it's funny that you should bring it up because my first collection of stories is called Arranged Marriage, and it deals with a lot of different kinds of marriages, some of which work and some of which don't. But arranged marriage has been a big part of the South Asian culture, and families have taken, a big role in the marriage of their children, because really in our culture, which is so family oriented, you don't just marry a person, you're really marrying into that family. And that is important, that should be compatible for a happy situation for everyone. So you would think that when people came here or they were born here, they would move away from that tradition. But interestingly, that's not the case, although it has changed its nature. Originally, all right, like the neighborhood auntie would know about a young man whose family is looking for a wife for him, and then the families would be put together, and then things would go from there. Now often it is like wedding sites So there's a big site called shadi.com, and shadi means wedding. And in fact, I have a wonderful book that I'm going to show you, which a friend of mine who is a wedding planner has put together, and it's called Shadi. And this is all weddings in the Houston area, in Texas, Indian weddings, because people love these big weddings. They love them and they invite all their non-Indian friends, and there's dancing and singing, and it goes on for like 3 days. So as you can see, a wedding is an important affair. So what's happening is a lot of young people are choosing arranged marriages or partially arranged marriages. They're quite happy to have their parents introduce them to people that they found through the Indian network, or these sites such as shadi.com, and there's a whole bunch of others, are where they can meet people.
Very interesting. So it's like Match.com is older than it thinks, has very ancient roots, but it didn't even realize.
Very ancient roots.
I'm taking notes. I got 2 boys. We'll see. As we kind of wrap this up, I remember on election day, I always see Chow post the "I voted" sticker.
Yeah. It's very important to be in it, to be a proud American. I don't take that voting lightly, and I take my daughters. We talk about, the privilege to vote, the responsibility to vote, to live in a country that, that affords us freedom and democracy. We didn't have that. My parents left with nothing. And, and when you talk about the reticence of immigrants sharing their story, I can't help but think about the trauma. In my older years, I could recognize that my father's anger or his frustration came from the trauma of losing everything and starting over and having to learn a language, and my mother working, and then we're in childcare, all these issues that are still very much in the forefront of immigrant issues in this country. Very heartened.
Yeah, it is, as always, a work in progress. Thank you.
Thank you.